Hey guys, GWS here. Here to do yet another video on the bias of Vox with some bonus content. We're going to be talking about tariffs and trade wars and protectionism. Again, I believe I've made several other videos on it, but we're making another one because Vox just made one. And it seems to be trending quite well. It's not on trending yet, but it's at 250 something thousand views. So we're going to do a response video where I'm going to go through point by point. As the video goes on, we'll be stopping it to do some commentary. But first of all, look at the title. Trade Wars Explained. So right off the bat, they're using the most extreme example in their title. And why are they doing that? Well, you're going to see that there's a theme of this video, and the theme is fear. To try to coerce you and to try to influence your position, and to try to gather public support over fear. And that is, that's what they're trying to do. So let's go ahead and play this video.
Is it this? Or maybe this? Well, there's a different type of war you may have heard a lot about recently.
Trade war.
So notice how they're already comparing trade wars to actual wars, and not just any wars, but the biggest wars we've ever had, World War II, and I think one of those is Desert Storm, or the Iraq War. So this is immediately meant to compare a trade war to a real war, as if to put into your head that this is the same thing, which it is not. It's not the same thing. It's not a type of war. Um, so let's go ahead and play the rest of this. But this is going to be a theme of Vox, again, throughout the video, fear-mongering.
Worries igniting.
Is the trade war back on?
Trade war.
Trade war, full-blooded trade war.
The weapons in a trade war are everywhere. It's the food you eat, the train you ride to work, and the laptop you're probably watching this video on.
As a consumer,
Yeah, again, some more fear-mongering. So when they do the comparison to reality, um, they're talking about other countries weaponizing the products that we buy, as in, like, these countries have this over us, which is the furthest thing from the truth. And we'll explain a lot more about this as we get into the actual tariff portion, because eventually we got to get in the facts and figures. We got to stop fear mongering here. And they'll get into some, and we'll be rebutting some of that. But the fact is that this is meant to elicit an emotional response to try to flip a position with a faux neutral response of coverage. That is, like, if they came out and they just said, free trade is good, this is why, these are the economists who agree with free trade, this is their justification to why tariffs are a bad thing, they're distortions to the market. No, that'd be too boring, that'd be too fact-based, and that's not there to elicit an emotional response. No, they're going with the fear-mongering option to try to influence one's position, especially if you're young and impressionable, and they're trying to go with it from there. So let's play more of this.
you're probably consuming imports. If we have a trade war and we start slapping tariffs on all of those imports, the bill is going to be higher.
Now notice he doesn't go into the justification of how the bill is going to be higher. And we'll be skipping over a lot of this, so I'll just briefly bring up, they're going to be talking about Smoot Hawley in like the future, and while they don't really directly compare it to the Great Depression, there's certainly the implication there, and also talking about how it benefits the USSR, more Russia fear mongering. You gotta have some of that in one of these videos, but we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves there. But the fact is, there's no justification, and before we get into that, I kind of want to get a little bit ahead of this and just say that the it's very different than what it was in the 1930s. the economy, the economic landscape, etc., is very different. And let me explain why it's different. Um, so, most of the prices of goods, and this is the dirty little secret you're going to learn, most of the prices of goods of any given ecosystem, be it a country, be it a state, be it a city, is based on the average earnings of people and is dictated almost entirely by supply and demand, not by production cost. That's a key thing, and this is one thing that you won't even hear from economists, is that most of the prices of goods that the end user buys are based on markup. So if the production price, for example, doubles, the markup is not going to double with it because it's not based on percentages. And the reason it's not based on percentages is because you have products with slim profit margins, you have products with wide profit margins. Yes, some of the slim ones you're going to see some price increases, perhaps heavily steel laden items or whatever. You may see, particularly on expensive goods, because expensive goods have slimmer margins often than cheaper goods, depending on, again, depending on what it is. You know, it's very dependent because everything is driven by supply and demand. Everything. So, let me just give you an example of this. You have something called the value added tax in Europe, which pretty much operates in the same way that a tariff would act. It is a tax that imposes a cost on production. And there's a very big difference between a VAT tax and a sales tax that we have in America, in the US. So, let me explain that difference. Like, in the US, if you go to, say, Walmart, you go to a store, you buy $100 worth of goods, and you pay a 5% sales tax, would mean the cost that you actually pay at the register is $105. With a VAT tax, which you get is that same tax on every line in production. Basically, everything that is bought and sold, you pay a VAT tax on. So, not only, like, say it costs $100 to produce something, um, not only is the end user going to pay that, the person who buys it markup or wholesale, whatever, now all of a sudden you have everybody up the line of manufacturing, the supply chain, they're paying that tax. So you get something taxed maybe 10 to 20 times before it gets to market. And in Europe, like if you look at places like Sweden, you look at places like the UK, I'd say the UK especially. Um, in fact, you know, bonus content, we're going to look up some numbers here. So what we're looking for is the PPP index by country. And I'll explain that in a second as soon as we find it. Iceland, Denmark. These are the top PPP indices. And so let's look at the UK because that's the important thing. And now I'm not liking you on Facebook. So what's that? Okay, here it is. United Kingdom. Now, the United Kingdom has a 20% VAT tax, right? You would think that the average cost of consumables would be insanely high. For example, as high as something like Denmark or Sweden, which have, I believe they were, Norway is 1.54. And let me explain what the PPP is first, because a lot of people are probably confused. The PPP index is what a dollar worth in the U.S. will produce in another, or will buy in another country. So, for example, if I bring $5 over to Norway, say the average cost of a loaf of bread is $4 in the U.S., which is, I think, is more or less what the average is, at least the urban average. $4 for a loaf of bread. You go to Norway, even if you exchange your currency for euros or whatever. I don't know what their currency is. I don't know if they pay in euros or not. I'm not that educated, but um, like if you go and exchange the currency, even with the exchange, you're going to be paying about $6 for a loaf of bread because the PPP index is 1.5, and so you multiply um, what you would pay in the U.S. By that number. And yeah, Norway's is high, but also notice Norway also has the highest average cost of living. And there's a lot of things that go into PPP, but here's the thing. The United Kingdom has a 20% VAT. Think of it as like a substitute for a tariff because it goes into the production of goods and services. It is a weight on trade. But look at this. Their PPP is only 1.1. 1.1. That's weird. This is 2005 too. Um, see, this is 2005. I need to look for a more recent data. Price level, conversion factor to market exchange. We're gonna go on a little data adventure here. Um, so this is, I think, more recent data. Here's 2016. United Kingdom. Actually, it's less. UK, for whatever reason, is 0.9. I don't know why it's that low, but um, the fact is that their PPP index is 0.9. So basically, their PPP index is about the same as it is in the United States. That is, the cost of goods and services in the UK is about the same as it is in the United States, despite the taxes. Why is that? Because if you look at average earnings, the United States, for actually, I think makes a little bit more, but their incomes are comparable, and the UK also has a lot more trade relationships with other nations. But the point that I'm making is that tariffs are not going to immediately increase prices just on the definition of it, as the person talking was saying. Like, he gave no numbers, he gave no references. Of course, Vox isn't going to give references because this is not a fact-based video. So let's play some more of this, see what else we can respond to.
If the world relies so much on trade, what is a trade war? And why do countries get caught up in them in the first place? Alright, global trade can be a dry topic, so let's jazz this up a little bit. To avoid any spoilers, let's say it's season 1 of Game of Thrones, and both the Tyrell and the Lannister kingdoms manufacture googly eyes.
We're gonna skip over the Game of Thrones stuff. It's a pretty bad explanation.
And there's more than one way they can start.
One possibility is you want to keep out a country's imports so that your domestic competitors have an edge. A second possibility is if there's a country that's doing something that you don't want them to, you can use a tariff as a way of inflicting a degree of pain, of economic pain on that country, and you say, until you change your evil ways, I'm going to make it hurt.
Okay, so who wins a trade war?
One way to think about who wins a trade war is looking at which country has more.
Now notice, nothing to do with trade, but notice that Vox is using their own writer as a reference and interview source, as in their source has actual credibility on this topic. Yeah, that guy, Mr. Hare, has credibility on, trade relations. Okay.
goods you ship to another country, the more vulnerable your goods are to punishing tariffs. So some economists would say that the country which ships fewer goods to the other has an advantage and can outlast the other in a big clash.
Trade wars can also boost the fortunes of countries that stand outside the fray. In the 1930s, the US enacted the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which put into place steep, sweeping tariffs on imports as a way to protect American
No, there's
workers
the
and
Depression
industries.
reference.
Canada and some European countries put up tariffs of their own, launching a trade war. Some of these countries then abandoned the US as a trading ally and took their trading elsewhere. Soviet Russia, a country not involved in the trade war,
Now, first of all, let's just be clear that they didn't just like abandon the U.S. and start trading with Russia. They were trading with Russia the whole time. Like Russia has had historically massive trade implications and huge relationships with European nations. And also, again, we're talking about the Great Depression here. So the reason why people stopped trading with the US was not because the US imposed tariffs. The reason people stopped trading with the US is because our economy basically just fell from the face of the earth. And Russia's didn't really have the same kind of fall because they had a whole different set of economic win conditions. Let's move on.
ended up gaining trading partners as a result of Smoot-Hawley. So, sometimes countries not involved in the trade war can benefit from one. But, as is the case with most wars, trade wars are harmful for almost everyone involved, particularly for poorer consumers.
Rising prices in a trade war can have ripple effects. When people have to spend more money on basics like clothing, it means they have less money to spend on other goods and services.
See, and notice too, there's not going to be any nuance as to the cost of clothing and why clothing is so cheap and why stuff, certain things, are going to increase. So, let me be clear. Yeah, the costs of certain things, not everything, are going to increase. But what you're not going to hear here is why the stuff is so cheap in the first place. If you look at countries that we're trading with, that we're buying this stuff with, and I'm sure a lot of us, if not 70% of us, are guilty of it, buying cheap clothes, or clothes that would be much cheaper than otherwise, because there's a lot of countries that just have wretched working conditions, and they're like, when we talk about worker rights, we talk about workplace safety, we talk about no child labor, we talk about at least some bare minimum of a livable wage. We talk about rights in arbitration, be it privately or in a court. We talk about a lot of different things. When they talk about it, when you go to Thailand, when you go to China, when you go to any of these other places and you talk about worker rights, you know what you're talking about? You're talking about suicide nets and slave wages. You don't get those rights. And yet the thing is, that's the entire reason why they can compete. So, what they're not going to even talk about here is the moral dimension. They're going to bring up clothing, but they're not telling you, like they'll go through their Game of Thrones explanation to pretend like they're giving you a nuanced explanation, but what they're not going to tell you is why certain things are cheap, and why, yeah, the price of certain things are going to go up, but that's a good thing, because guess what? People are making that stuff now who are actually getting paid to make it. No slave labor, no wretched working conditions, no child labor, none of that. And so, but like I said, you'll never hear this from the free trade worshippers, because They want to believe, number one, that free trade is going to improve working conditions. There's no evidence of this at all. But they want to believe it. And more importantly, number two, they want you to ignore it. They want you to ignore it because it's like the Romans. Pay attention to the bath that you lounge in. Pay no attention to the people who are working in 150-degree weather, and who are dying from heat stroke below you. Pay no attention to them, but pay attention to your relaxation. It is a Roman bias. That's how I like to think of it.
And that can dampen the pace of the economy.
Traditionally, when you've looked at trade protection, we often put higher protection on goods that are consumed by poor people. There are economists who have documented that systematically you tend to find higher tariffs
And
on
again,
things
at
like
whose expense is
low-end
this?
clothing, shoes, sugar, which play a disproportionate role in the spending of people who are less well off.
See, they won't talk
In
about the
April,
labor
President Trump
conditions.
unveiled a list of over 1,000 Chinese exports. Things like aircraft parts, TVs, and medical devices that he planned to place tariffs on as a way to punish
Now, notice too how they just completely ignore what they just said. Like they said, tariffs often target items for the poor, and yet Trump is targeting like items for maybe not so poor people.
Beijing for restricting U.S. investment in China and for stealing American intellectual property. The very next day, China struck back, unveiling its own list of U.S. exports that it planned to place tariffs on. Since then, Trump has threatened another round of tariffs, with China ready to respond with its own additional tariffs. The whole situation is starting to look a lot like a trade war.
Countries disagree on fair and unfair trade practices all the time, but there's something unique about Trump's approach to it. The unpredictability, the wild threats, the disinterest in even pretending to play by the rules. Trump isn't just
What rules? What rules? Playing by what rules are we talking about? See, that's the thing, and really, it's like this is what you get when you got somebody who's talking without a filter.
destabilizing trade relations with China or any other country he threatens. He's destabilizing the entire global system of trade.
The global system of trade, and we're just going to end this here, that benefits who? Who's benefiting? Like, the system, as in the one we're living under, like, what's benefiting? Who's benefiting? I don't usually go on a harp about this, but here's the thing. Income inequality is not a problem. It is a symptom of a problem. I don't care if somebody gets rich. In fact, if somebody's rich, good for them. But the reality is that when you have so few people who have so much control, I believe it was like 6 people have control of 10% or whatever. It's some huge percentage of the world's economies. And when you have these gigantic mega corporations who are beyond the sovereignty of any individual nation, so vast that they can actually influence trade relations with, for example, Pacific nations in the TPP, where they can supersede the sovereignty of one nation's laws in order to trade with others. That is, these companies can make the U.S. their own personal Thailand. They can pollute the environment. They can do everything against our environmental laws, because when you're talking about TPP, you're talking about superseding national laws for this international relationship and the ability for any nation to sue a nation for too many, yes, too many labor protections. So you're going to the least common denominator at that point. And it's like, I 100% am a deregulator. I think that we should deregulate. But here's the reality of the situation we live in. We are a fairly highly regulated nation when it comes to our businesses, globally speaking, especially when compared to Southeast Asia. We have a lot higher taxes. We have a lot higher labor standards. We have a lot higher standards of living. We have a lot more expectations and entitlements in this nation. That's a given. That's not even on the table. That's just a given. And people aren't going to give those up. They're not going to give up their basics. So this creates the unfair advantage, but they're wanting to go the other way. And not only do we get the economic disadvantage of having to trade with countries with inferior standards, but those countries can also turn around and sue us for even more money. So not only is that not even free trade, it's even further away from free trade, fair trade, than something like NAFTA or CAFTA. So, like I said, see, this video was meant for fear mongering. And in fact, let's play something here.
Whether it's thanks for watching, and thanks to Principal Financial for sponsoring Vox Video.
Yeah, thank you to Principal Financial for sponsoring this Vox video. So, notice notice who they got backing them up. Vox is owned by, I can't remember who it was, like some kind of Viacom or something. I'm not sure who owns them, but it's a multi-billion-dollar international corporation that owns Vox. Them, as well as the economists who support free trade, and there's a lot of them. There are a lot of economists. They benefit from this system. And the problem with the system is, yes, you have more economic productivity. That is true. If you have tariffs, it's going to decrease global production. That is true. That's just a fact. But at the same time, when you do tariffs and you have a production-based economy again with high labor standards, you can equalize the prospects of people in this world, especially in wealthier nations with high inequality such as the US. You can start to equalize things for workers without overbearing government regulations, without oppressive domestic taxes. You could start to actually equalize the outcomes, even if there won't be as high of a total supply. The fact is, we can increase our own security, and that's a big thing too, is security. You won't hear anything about the U.S. interest, because for the U.S. it is a lot more secure if we're producing most of our own goods. Now, let me just make a final point here. I'm not against trade. I'm not against even trade deals. But we have to start looking at balancing things based on the standards of other nations as well as the benefit. Nations benefit from trading with the United States because we have a lot to offer and we have a lot of money that we can use to buy other people's goods. And so what we have to do is we have to balance it. Like, if you want to do business with us, we are going to balance with tariffs. That is our policy. If you do not want to trade with us, that is your decision. And that's an important thing. Another important thing, too, and I probably should have gone over this earlier, but we're going to go over it now, is the pressure that trade creates. The pressure that tariffs create. So for example, when you had Japan embargo all the rubber from us after they took over all the Pacific Islands, what happened? We invented synthetic rubber, which was better than the rubber we was using before in our previous tires. So when you have economic pressure, not only do you have more domestic goods developed, but for solutions that once required other nations, all of a sudden you get unique solutions that bypass, or perhaps you can prospect and mine some more rare earth metals in the US, and we could start to produce more of those. Like, rare earth metals are everywhere. The the whole thing is just, do you have the perseverance to find it? China got into that business early on, and they're benefiting greatly. And that's a lot of the trade deficits because they're finding the rare earth metals, and that's required in a lot of high-end electronics, like computers, like the laptops they were showing. Which, by the way, look up lithium and cobalt mining and come back to me and tell me that you're also for cheap lithium ion batteries. Some of the most wretched conditions. The half life of people is like freaking 30 years old. So, anyhow, I'm going to wrap this up here. Um, More propaganda from Vox from the left wing. Thanks for listening, guys. God bless.